Chapter 12. Ernest watched Lord Henry climb the last flight of stairs. The man showed no sign of distress or breathlessness. In fact, he might have been strolling on a level promenade. His cane swung lightly in one hand. His hat held in the crook of his other arm. There was a regular cadence to the sound of his steps against metal. Like a metronome. Or an automaton. Too real. His mind rejected the connection. He looked human. He had skin and normal eyes. He was a man, except no man could walk with that kind of precision, at least, could soldiers? He did not know. Was that precise timing possible, on a rising stairway? The distance between the stairs would have to be close to precise. Even a small difference would throw off the timing. Lord Henry reached his level and stopped, his chest rising and falling without distress of any kind. Automatons didn't breathe. Their chests didn't rise or fall. They didn't have lungs. Their clockwork hearts took up most of the chest cavity. There was sweat on his skin. Lines around the eyes. He was a man, therefore that kind of precision must be possible. At least it was not an impossible possible this time. It only felt like it was. Lord Henry shifted his hat to a position under the arm holding his cane, and bowed very slightly. Miss Smith not here? Why the pause before her name? She's servicing the lamps inside the Fresnel. His gaze flicked up. Automaton eyes couldn't do that. They couldn't show emotion. Not that Ernest could see an abundance of emotion in his eyes, but there was intelligence. Awareness. His eyes were quite compelling, he realized, and found it took effort to look away. I'm surprised you made it back, sir, Ernest said. The storm seems to have reached this location. Or as imminent. We have already experienced some flooding. The dark brows rose. But I have only been gone an hour. An hour? Ernest blinked. We started for the mainland, and the wind came up, and we decided to return here. Without the lamp, we would not have found our way back. We? Where's your crew, sir? Do they need my automatons? Lord Henry looked surprised. They remain with the ship. His glance flicked toward Ernest's crew, then back to Ernest, a question in them. His lips tightened, but he did not respond to the unspoken question, nor would he have had the question spoken. He wanted to protest Lord Henry's callousness, but was aware of his own hypocrisy. He had, several times, put the automatons between himself and danger, but he would never leave them behind when a choice was offered. Though in this circumstance, it was hard to make the case that they were safer here with him. Niles? The automaton's eyes flickered to active. Yes, sir. Go down to Crispin, and both of you keep a watch on the water levels out there. Oh, and Niles, the automaton looked back, try to stay dry. I mean, move higher if you need to. Yes, sir. Niles clunked ponderously down the stairs towards his counterpart. As it approached, Winston came back to awareness. For just a moment, it seemed its eyes glowed red, but it must have been a trick of the light. Had to have been, because it was impossible. The metal eyes could only be silver. And inside his head he heard her voice saying, 6 impossible things. Had they reached 6 yet? He was getting rather tired of the impossible. Now he looked at Lord Henry, his mind returning to his statement that he'd only been gone an hour. Since his watch was not tracking time in a reasonable manner, he had only his senses to track the passage of time. It felt longer but also shorter. In fact, it felt as if time were speeding up after going very slowly. I'm not sure you made the better choice in returning here, sir. If he hesitated, instruments are in any way accurate, we are in the direct path of this storm. Lord Henry looked more pleased than worried. Do you think it is the storm? I do not know. May I see your instruments? Of course, sir. They were only on the other side of the central pillar, so Ernest led him there. There was a long silence while Lord Henry looked at each one. Finally, he glanced at the crates that the automatons hadn't unpacked. They were mostly papers, but also pieces of instruments Ernest was working on. It almost seemed that Lord Henry looked disappointed. "Is something wrong, sir?" Lord Henry's lips twisted. "I had hoped to see something original from an inventor such as yourself." He couldn't know about the Blizzblighter 3000, now hidden up in the peak of the lamp room's ceiling. No one had known until Prudence. "I have some ideas sketched out, but sometimes one can't improve on what has already been done." He half shrugged, hoped he managed to sound rueful. "Indeed, I'm glad to be spared the embarrassment, since none of these are working properly." Lord Henry looked disconcerted. Had he not known how to read the instruments? He recovered very quickly. "Perhaps you picked something up on your travels that is interfering with them?" Lord Henry knew about the meteorite. Ernest felt it, though he'd have discounted it prior to meeting Prudence. Had he spoken with the driller who gave it to Ernest? That is the only way he could have known. But why would the man have told him? Why would Lord Henry care? What was his interest? Other than the fact that it was not of this world, it seemed a side issue in the face of the storm. All he could think to do was play along. Ernest looked thoughtful, nodded slowly. "I suppose that is possible. Winston, when you and Fred packed these crates, did they have any mineral substances in them?" He knew it was a safe question for his very literal automatons. "The crates contain your research materials, sir," Winston said. "Books and papers." Fred pointed to one half-empty crate. "That one has a few pieces of incomplete instruments that you were working on." "May I?" Lord Henry asked, already moving toward that crate. He bent over it, grabbing at the pieces of straw in a manner that was borderline frantic. He stopped and looked at Ernest, his smile forced. "These devices look intriguing, Doctor." "Well, so far they have been frustrating." Ernest picked up a piece of one, turned it in his hand, then dropped it back in the crate. Lord Henry glanced at the automatons, then the stairs. With lowered voice, he said, "I've come with a warning for you, Dr. Warren." From Dr. Masterson. Prudence had come from Masterson. Or said she had. But he'd felt that the knowing he'd felt about her was real, that this sense of doing this before, a knowing that was not knowledge, he reminded himself. A trap? With her up there and Lord Henry here? He had only their word they didn't know each other. And her wild story. And honest eyes. Only that and his instincts to put against wealth and eyes that were eerily compelling. And as calm as his breathing. Too real? "You are in great danger." His gaze flicked toward the stairs again, as if to indicate Prudence was that danger. There was a clatter of some sort overhead. "Ernest," she called out, "could you step up here for a minute?" Her tone was in opposition to her words, he noted, wondering if the trap were closing. And who was supposed to be in it? "Take care," Lord Henry cautioned, grasping his arm with a cold hand. He should have had that advice 4 years ago, Ernest thought somewhat ruefully. Despite his concerns, Ernest shook off Lord Henry's hand and went for the stairs, felt cold air spilling down from the lamp room as he leapt up 2 at a time. How could a room that had been stifling and hot now be cold as the Arctic? Prudence stood at the top, gripping the rail, her face so white her eyes looked like black stones. "What's happened?" The chill was so intense he could see his breath and hers, like fog filtered with the lamplight. He heard Lord Henry climbing up after him and grabbed her shoulders, had to tug to get her to let loose the rail. She was cold, even through her leathers. His hand slid down her arms and gripped the chunks of ice that were her hands. "What's wrong?" he asked again. Instead of answering, her gaze tracked past his shoulder. He followed her gaze, half turning them both in the process. This was one impossible too far. And yet, hadn't he already seen this? Just before he blacked out on the weatherman. "Wait here," he said, his grip loosening, but her hands tightened. "No." Pale tongue licked dry, barely visible lips. I'll go with you. The instinct to protect was strong, but she unslung her weapon, holding it with the muzzle pointed down. He opened the door. It wasn't on the latch, so he only had to pull it back. He bent and stepped out on the ledge. It had seemed generous earlier. Now it did not. A raucous cry, quickly followed by that of its mate, sounded overhead. He was somewhat aware that the dragons were back, that they circled above the light, shadows weaving past each other in a regular pattern. The ship was a disturbing sight. Transparent, with pulses of light tracing along its structure. There was fog, but mostly in wisps that clung to the sides of the airship. A bit of fog would push out and then jerk back, as if it hit a barrier or worse. And there were the eyes. He remembered the eyes. And this cold, he realized. He'd felt this cold during his last encounter with this ship. He wanted to consider the temperature, because it was easier to contemplate than the eyes. So many of them, staring at them. Eyes that glittered. Eyes that pleaded. Eyes filled with fear. Eyes filled hatred. He searched them, afraid to see and afraid to not see her eyes. He didn't realize he'd relaxed some until Prudence spoke, her voice hoarse. She's not there. He wrenched his gaze away, looked down at her. If anything, her skin was whiter than it had been, and tightly stretched across her cheekbones. She shrank back as Lord Henry climbed out next to her. He looked curious. So these must be the specters in the storm, he said. He looked at Prudence, his mouth acquiring a cruel edge. Do you recognize anyone? There was a long silence as she stared at him, then imperceptibly at first, her back straightened, then her whole body. She pushed away from the lighthouse until she stood on both feet. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak there was a rattle and groan, though not exactly a groan either. The sound was unearthly. Ernest felt such dread, it was all he could do to maintain his stance. Prudence's grip on his hand tightened. The visible specters appeared to be falling back, or to either side, clearing a path if it was possible to have a path over nothing. Some of the specters looked as if they cowered back, while others had gloating looks in their red eyes. What is it? She asked, looking to Ernest. But it was Lord Henry who spoke. Don't you recognize him? Granted he has changed. What was he talking about? Recognize who? Prudence felt both slow and stupid and scared silly. But the warmth of Ernest's hand kept her grounded, well, mostly. If this were the trap, she'd have preferred a spider web. Probably. She didn't like spiders either. A figure began to emerge from the inky blackness at the back of the ship. A gray human-like shadow that moved slowly, each step sending a ghostly rattle that made some of the specters crouch in fear. Others seemed to laugh, black hole mouths opening beneath those red eyes. In the air in front of her, a portal tried to form. Just a shimmer because she fought it back. She didn't look at Lord Henry, but she felt his pleasure at this small betrayal. The figure reached the prow of the ship. His essence seemed to quiver, then sharpen until she could see it was a man. A man in chains, chains that glowed briefly blue with each step, chains wrapped around him from the top of his head to the feet visible through the transparent side of the ship. Only his face was free enough to see. His eyes were wild and tormented. So much pain in them, the weight of his pain dragged her down. Her knees started to buckle, but Ernest grabbed her, his arm sliding around her waist to keep her on her feet. Those eyes turned slowly toward her. She wanted to cower from them, from discovery, but she couldn't move. The eyes saw her. They showed recognition. How was that possible? The mouth opened, releasing a scream that reverberated through her skin and bone. And through her mind. With rising terror, she saw fine cracks in the dimensional lines inside her head, saw some of those lines get damaged, some disconnect. If one of those was the one home. She felt herself being dragged back, away from the chained man, away from the ship, and then she couldn't see him with her eyes, but it didn't matter. The eyes were in her head, looking at her through the lines. The broken lines. She couldn't, and then it hit her, and she knew. Her head fell back. against a shoulder that felt so safe and warm, but safe was an illusion. A ruse. What's wrong? What has happened? Ernest sounded frantic. Not like himself at all. And so very far away. With some effort she turned her head toward him. Saw panic in his eyes. What was it? He gave her a small shake. Not what? Who? My grandfather. Your grandfather? What? The color drained from his face. That's him, but why? I'd rather die, she said, surprised at how loud the words sounded in the deep silence. He pulled her to his chest, holding her so tight she almost couldn't breathe. She didn't care. His heart beat against her cheek. He was alive. She was still alive. She wasn't sure that was good. You're not going to die, he said. She grabbed his jacket lapel. Promise me you won't let it have me. That you'll kill me rather than let that happen. Prue. Promise me you'll use the gun. His lips thinned, then he set his mouth against her ear. What if that is what we did before? This question cleared some of the panic. She took several breaths. Does it feel wrong? He hesitated. Of course it does. But I can't tell if. Dr. Warren? She tightened her grip. I don't like him. His lips widened into the strained version of a smile. Neither do I. Can you help me up? She honestly wasn't sure she could stand or stay there if he did help her up, but she wasn't going to cower at the feet of Lord Henry or whatever it was holding her grandfather prisoner out there. He was a prisoner. The chains confirmed that truth. She managed to get up just. She gripped his shoulders. I just want you to know, no matter what. She realized he wasn't looking at her, but past her. I don't want to know. Despite this, her body somehow turned to look. Her grandfather was still there, but he'd been joined by someone. A woman. Prudence felt Ernest stiffen as he recognized her too. Ophelia. And now you are finally beginning to understand, Lord Henry said, his tone one who had waited far too long for this moment and was determined to enjoy it to the maximum. And yet somehow I don't, Prudence said, her voice thin and strained. What's wrong with him, with them? There is nothing wrong with them. They rejoice because their life force serves the master. Yeah, they look like it's the Jets. Thrilled to their toes, oh wait, they don't seem to have toes. Ernest found he could almost smile, even though some of her words puzzled him. There was a flicker, then the lighthouse lamp lost some of its brightness. One of the lamps inside the Fresnel has gone out, Prudence said almost absently. I should refill it. If she felt like Ernest did right now, she could not move. The ice in the air had moved into his bones, into his sinews. As if the lessening of the light allowed it, more of the airship moved closer to the lighthouse tower. One of the dragons dropped through the light canopy, landing on the railing of the balcony. Its red eyes regarded them through the glass, then blew a stream of fire against it. The room grew colder still. It's an automaton, he murmured, not sure he'd said the words out loud until Prudence stirred in his hold. But also more. He stood between her and Lord Henry, who held the door open with his body. The dragon dropped down on the ledge and started for the door, its pulsing red eyes seemingly fixed on Ernest. Each step shook the lighthouse tower. The steps seemed to reverberate inside the storm too, like echoes of distant thunder. If you have it, Dr. Warren, now would be a good time to produce it, Lord Henry said. The dragon was more clumsy on the ledge, but it hadn't far to go to reach the door. It filled the doorway, flexing its wings once and crying out. Its head reared back, the neck elongating as if it was preparing to spew fire, but a light shot from beside Ernest before the dragon could spew. It tracked toward the dragon, straight and true and cleanly white, striking the dragon in the chest. Lightning danced across its metal surface, giving flashed views of its mechanical insides, and then it tumbled back, crashing through the railing and falling out of sight without a sound. What the? He looked around and realized Prudence had managed to raise her long weapon and fire. Lord Henry looked at Ernest, his eyes suddenly turning the same red as the dragon. That was unfortunate. Maybe, Prudence said, but it felt good. From deep within the storm, thunder sounded louder and closer, like a death drum rising and falling. You've made him angry. Lord Henry smiled, his eyes gleaming as if anger pleased him. Ernest stepped more fully between Prudence and Lord Henry. He laughed. The sound of it echoed again and again, building instead of diminishing. You cannot help her, he told Ernest. He lifted his cane, exposing the head. It was a smaller version of the dragon Prudence had shot. Its eyes were red too, and its mouth opened to expel a smaller spout of flame. Then the screaming started. Thousands of voices, as if the shot had hurt them too. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.